Hello, everyone, and welcome to the podcast, Life is a Story We Tell Ourselves. We have a special guest today, Yosemite Ranger and Buffalo Soldier reenactor, Shelton Johnson. Shelton has appeared and starred in the Ken Burns docuseries on national parks and appeared on the Oprah Winfrey Show. So, Sheldon, welcome to the show.
Well, thank you, Don. It's a pleasure being here.
Yeah, and it's good to see you. I mean, it's always good to see an old friend. I think we've known each other for something like 20 years, and so it's fun to see you again and to hear your voice. But we're going to get right into it. I'm really anxious to ask you, even though I've known you for all these years, exactly how you went from Detroit, Michigan, to Yosemite, and I'm sure there were stops along the way.
I'm talking to you right now because my father served in the military. He was in the Army, in Korea and in Berlin right after World War II. He was in the Air Force in Vietnam. He also was in Greenland, which he didn't talk about quite a bit, even though it's the largest national park in the world is in Greenland and it looks beautiful. But my father was in an underground bunker, so his mindset was a little bit different. But my family lived in Germany when I was a kid, because of his military service. And we lived in the Saarland. We lived in a little village called Kontwisch near a bigger town called Zweibrücken. And the key thing of what I'm saying or trying to communicate is that there was a family trip to Berchtesgaden in the Bavarian Alps in the Saarland. And that's the earliest thing I can remember. I was 5 years old. And there we were walking around and through the Bavarian Alps. I remember being at the edge of a viewing area where there was just an abyss beneath my feet. I'm holding my mother's hand and my father's hand simultaneously. And it was breezy, as it always is, usually in the mountains. And I remember thinking that the only thing tying me to the earth were the hands of my mom and the hands of my dad. And I looked up and looked out and saw peaks surrounding me. And there were banners of snow unfurling from these peaks, and the light was transfusing through the clouds. I looked down, there were more clouds beneath my feet. Now that is something, to look beneath your feet and see clouds, and then to see the shadow of those clouds drifting on the ground thousands of feet below the clouds. And I thought I must have been on the edge of the earth and the edge of the sky. I was in that space in between, and I never forgot that moment. It was a transcendent moment. And I know you've had transcendent moments yourself, so you know what that feels like. And so I never forgot that. And because of that one event, when we finally moved back to Detroit, and I had these memories of being on that mountaintop, I thought it was a dream because there's nothing in Detroit that is vaguely similar to the Bavarian Alps, which is completely different. So thinking about where you are right now, with you have the Andes right there. Yeah. There's nothing like that in Detroit. And I'm not knocking Detroit, but it's the Great Lakes. It's a beautiful place, but it's just not Bavaria. So that's how I got that. That's that seed that was actually put in me from that experience of being with my parents and my brother on a mountain peak in Berchtesgaden in the Bavarian Alps. And that's why I'm a park ranger, because I never forgot that. And I've always since that moment felt this pulling of spirit, this pulling of mind of going home. And so whenever I'm in the mountains, anywhere in the world, I feel like my mom and my dad are still on this earth and I'm with them. And my brother is there too.
I already mentioned that you're a Buffalo Soldier reenactor. And so how did that end up coming about? I have my own stories about the Buffalo Soldiers, but, you've taken it to a whole, another level in terms of interpreting the Buffalo Soldiers. So how did that all start?
Well, it's that thing of building on the work of others. There aren't very many African Americans, as you well know, that work in Western parks. So when I arrived in Yosemite, I met a young African American woman who was a ranger here. It's not just a ranger here. She was the first African American woman to be a ranger, as far as I know, in Yosemite. And her name is Althea Roberson. So Althea told the story of Buffalo Soldiers in Yosemite, but hardly any other interpreters were telling that story. So I just listened to her and took some notes and said, this is a fascinating story. And that's what started it all. So she eventually left. And what I didn't realize at the time was that how you know how sometimes when you tell a story, you may think you're the first, but there are others who came before you?
Oh, yes.
Yeah. Well, people have the perception that I was the first person to tell the Buffalo Soldier story, but as far as I know, I'm the third person. I mean, Althea told it before I did, and she developed programs about that history. And then an African-American man that I've never met, who was a ranger down in Wawona, used to work for Dean Shank. His name is Kenneth Noel. He actually performed as a Buffalo Soldier, I think back in the 70s. And so what I did was learn from my predecessors. I learned from Kenneth, even though I had never met him. I knew that he told the story. I learned from Althea. And what I focused on was, this story will go far if it can get beyond the borders of Yosemite itself. If it just stays within the boundaries of the park, it just becomes a park story. But I recognized that story had significance, cultural significance, that was national and even international. So,
well, tell us briefly who the Buffalo Soldiers are. Let our listeners understand. We've mentioned Buffalo Soldiers, but they're probably 85% of the population, maybe more,
right.
has never heard of the Buffalo Soldiers. So just briefly tell us who those soldiers are.
Yeah, these African-American regiments in the United States Army were formed in 1866. And the military was completely segregated, basically from essentially the Revolutionary War all the way until 1948, when President Truman passed an executive order ending segregation in the military. Now, it didn't really happen. My father served in Korea and Vietnam, was in Berlin right after World War II. And my dad told me, well, son, that didn't happen. It was still segregated, even when he was in Korea. But they were called Buffalo Soldiers because they served in the Trans-Mississippi West. And in their encounters with Plains Indians, the Lakota, Dakota Sioux, the Cheyenne, and so forth, these native and these indigenous people saw that the hair on the heads of these soldiers was just like the matted cushion between the horns of the buffalo. So that's how they became known as Buffalo Soldiers. That's one story. Another story is, of course, that the soldiers used to wear these big buffalo coats. I've seen photographs, historic photographs of them wearing these thick coats. And so when you look at these coats with them and they're in the middle of them, and the coats are the coats of the hide of a bison, you couldn't really tell where the bison ended and the soldier began because of the darkness of their skin.
That's a great story.
Put those two things together, their dark complected skin, the buffalo robes, and then, of course, the curly hair on their heads, which was just like the bison. That's supposedly is how the name came into being. But earliest known reference is Celia Crocker Thompson, letters from an Army officer's wife in the early 1870s. Mm-hmm. And the irony of all of this is that even though I call these soldiers, meaning the 9th Regiment of Cavalry and the 24th Regiment of Infantry, who are the ones who specifically served in the Sierra Nevada, technically speaking, they weren't true Buffalo Soldiers in the sense that they didn't fight the indigenous people. That's how they got that name, was during the Indian Wars. But the soldiers who served in the Sierra Nevada were Spanish-American War veterans. They were veterans of the Philippine insurrection. But I call them Buffalo Soldiers because otherwise no one would know what I'm talking about. If I said, well, they were part of the segregated army, which was in existence from almost from the beginning to 1948, they wouldn't know what I'm talking. So I just say, okay, 9th Cavalry is a Buffalo Soldier regiment. 24th Infantry is a Buffalo Soldier regiment. And so that's why I just started calling them Buffalo Soldiers, because it's the only thing that really made sense, because they dealt with all the same issues that their predecessors dealt with in the 1870s, 1860s, except they weren't fighting Native people. They were serving essentially as the first park rangers, or among the first park rangers in what would become the National Park System. And that was in 1899, 1903, 1904, and it was a duality. It was both service in Yosemite and service in Sequoia. And of course, Sequoia is noteworthy because Charles Young, the third African-American to graduate from West Point, who once famously said the worst thing he could ever wish of an enemy would be to make them colored and a cadet at West Point. He was the first superintendent, first African-American superintendent in Sequoia in 1903. And under his leadership, the first trail to the top of Mount Whitney was built in 1903, along with the first usable wagon road into Sequoia's giant forest. That was built by literally the hands of 9th Cavalry troops.
Yes, he was much revered, too, by his men. And I know you remember the story that I'll have to interject here, that he was so revered by his men that they wanted to name one of the giant sequoias after him.
That's right.
And he demurred. He said, no, I'm not, that important. And he demurred and decided, that they needed to name a tree for Booker T. Washington.
That's right.
And that's how it came about that there was a Booker T. Washington tree in Sequoia, Kings Canyon National Park. And of course, that tree was lost for a long time as well.
Yeah. And then oh, sorry, go ahead.
I was just going to say, and interestingly enough, was rediscovered during my tenure, as deputy director. And I'm sure you know the story from there.
Yeah, that was Ward, the archivist there, Ward Eldridge. He just took the description of where the tree might have been and actually looked up at the right tree at the right time and saw the holes, the nails. I think the nails were still sticking out that held the sign that said Booker T. Washington tree.
But the story of the Buffalo Soldiers, now you've taken that, nationally and internationally, haven't you? Yes.
Yeah, I was asked to be the keynote speaker at the 8th World Ranger Congress when it was in Estes Park, Colorado, during the Centennial 2016. So that was a very powerful moment to perform in front of 140, 150 Rangers from all over the world. The only thing I could hear in my head was just, don't screw up.
So part of your presentation has been, and I've always been curious about this, you've been very gracious with me during my career and coming and helping me in different ways with your character. And the last time we were together and you were playing the flute as part of, the character plays the flute as part of your interpretive presentation. I've always wanted to ask you, where did that music come from? Why the flute? What that has to do with you interpreting this character?
It was playing the cedar flute, the Plains Indian flute, or the eagle bone flute, was a way of expressing that the character is also indigenous. The character is also not just indigenous in the sense of his African ancestry, but is indigenous to North America because of his Indian ancestry. So Elijah Yancey is a Black Indian. So he's playing a Plains Indian flute, which he probably got or picked up as a soldier on the Great Plains when he was in the Indian Wars. And because of his ancestry of being Cherokee and Seminole, he sees that flute as a means of communication at a volume, at a level, and intensity that maybe words aren't capable of. And that's what I think that's why music exists. I usually put it this way: music expresses the inexpressible, the things that we cannot put into words, that cannot be put into language, that are sounded. And you feel the emotion, you feel the joy, you feel the happiness, you feel the sorrow just in the notes themselves. And that's why I felt that since you're talking about race, which makes people uncomfortable, as soon as you start seeing people get too uncomfortable, pull out the flute. Start playing the flute.
Indeed. So the tune that you played, did you write that? Is that your music?
My background is, as I said, it's classical music and jazz. So with the flute, I just play what I'm feeling at the time. So if you want me to give you a sense of how I'm feeling right at the time, I can just play.
Well, why don't you do that right now?
Okay.
Oh, that's just absolutely beautiful. Thank you for that. Your efforts with the Buffalo Soldiers then led, to you writing a book, Glory Land, with this, bigger than life, at least for me, character Elijah Yancey. So just say a little bit about the book and what led to you writing the book and the story that it tells.
Yeah, the thing is, I've always had it in my mind that it was important for me to leave something behind when I'm gone, in terms of this work, to connect African Americans to their national parks. And so it wasn't enough just to perform on stage with a play, Yosemite Through the Eyes of a Buffalo Soldier. I just had this thought, I'm eventually going to retire. I'm going to leave. Will this story just disappear again? So that's why I made a film for PBS with Sterling Johnson. And it's a film version of my Buffalo Soldier play that was photographed over 3 years in Yosemite's high country on horseback with three Buffalo Soldier reenactors. We all we needed was Denzel, but we couldn't get him. That wasn't enough. And so I just felt that since I had gone into the Park Service. And prior to that, I was a graduate student at the University of Michigan in their MFA program in poetry. I felt, well, I had two choices. I could write a 5,000 line epic poem about buffalo soldiers. And I thought, what's the market for epic poems right about now?
Right.
And unrhymed iambic pentameter, the blank verse, the verse of Milton, and I thought, what about buffalo soldier agonistes? I don't know if that's
No, that won't work.
No, that won't work. So I realized that it had to be the novel, because there have been very few epic poems that have been turned into movies, but lots of books get turned into movies. So that's why I wrote Gloryland. So that way I could really pull people inside the story in a way that's harder to do when you're on stage, because you just have limited time, and the impact is more limited as well. So that was my statement to write Gloryland. I had to do that.
No, I understand. Well, I hope people get a chance to read Gloryland. It's an excellent novel, and you'll fall in love with Elijah Yancey, I think. I already have, and it's a great book available on Amazon. And what I love about it is that it's available on Audible as well, and you are the narrator. You're reading.
Yeah,
and that's just absolutely fantastic. I'm glad you're the one telling the story.
Well, it's so funny, because that was not the original deal. I mean, I asked Helen Sweetland was the person I worked with at Sierra Club Books, and I was very happy with Sierra Club and everything that they did for me and for the book. And but I asked her about that, and she said, "Well, the thing is, Shelton, that in general, these Audible books, these Audible things, they usually reserved for bestsellers. And we love your book, and we're just proud of being part of it, but it's not a bestseller." And then what happened was the company in New York, I can't remember if it was Recorded Books, Audible, they contacted the publisher and they said, "Hey, we read this book and we think it'd be a great audio book, and we'd like Shelton to read it." So that's how it happened. It's like, instead of like the mountain going to Muhammad going to the mountain, the people publishing the audiobook came to my publisher and asked to do it. So that's how it happened.
That is absolutely awesome. Well, I'm a big fan of Paul Harvey. And, he had that radio program for years, The Rest of the Story. And most people don't realize how difficult it is to write a book. And not only to write a book, but in your case, you were a ranger telling the story of the Buffalo Soldier, which was in part of your employ as a National Park Service ranger. And so just getting the book written for you was a challenge, wasn't it?
Oh, yeah, because I'm still working full time. And then, of course, there was the secondary, which is not so secondary, issue of that once the book was written, the word was communicated to me saying, "Well, Shelton, we've already paid you for that book because of your, so you can't get paid for doing this." And I said, I had to essentially argue that writing a book is not the same thing as creating an interpretive program. That's why there's separate Oscars for best adapted screenplay, best screenplay, on all of that. And so, and then of course, my play is improvisatory theater. I never wrote down my play. I just wore the cavalry uniform, stood for the first time in front of a live audience, and I had done so much research and I knew my character so well. I'm a method actor. So I was just fully invested in this story and this person that I didn't need a script, because you as Don Murphy, you don't need a script to be Don Murphy. You're Don Murphy. So as Elijah Yancey, or Lizzie Bowman as the counterpart on stage, I didn't need to figure out who he was. I knew who he was. He was a combination of my father and my grandfather, a Black Cherokee from Oklahoma. So I knew him so well that I didn't need to have a story, because he would just tell his own story. And it just happened. I just started telling stories that could be true based on all the years of research that I had done about this history. And it just came to life in front of a live audience.
Well, as you know, I've written several books as well. And I always tell people in writing groups something you said that's extremely important. If you know your character well, and if your character knows you well, your character ends up telling the story.
That's right.
You become a channel or a vehicle for, and that's such a powerful part of storytelling.
Oh, yeah.
And if you come from a line of storytellers like I do, and you very early on see that the people telling the stories become the character.
That's right.
And you channel those folks. And that certainly has been the case. And I think that's why your performances are so spellbinding, and not just spellbinding, but they communicate. And
Well,
of course, that's what it's all about.
Well, see, and I think of it this way. I think of it as like, remember Charles Dickens used to think of his books kind of as his children. You know, I remember reading that at some point. I don't think of my characters or characters in a book as being characters. I think of them as people who who exist somewhere in the universe. All you're doing is giving them an outlet so that they can tell the story and speak. So my perception is this: if you think of these people as people, then the reader reading it will read them and experience them as people. But if you only think of them as characters and you're giving all these different shadings and nuances to bring them to life, they'll never be really fleshed out. They'll never be real.
Yes.
But if you think of them initially as the author, as these are real human beings who are looking for a gap in reality to walk through and express their own reality to an audience, then it's going to be, then they're going to sound real. They're going to feel real to the reader. So I don't think of Elijah Yancey as a character. I think of him as a real person that has inhabited me and is using me as an instrument to tell his own story.
I just love that. That is so true. No, thank you for that. Well, I'm going to segue into something a little different. I understand you have a new position that you've been promoted to. That has to do with diversity and getting people to feel more welcomed, people of color to feel more welcome in parks and that sort of thing. Yes. Is that correct?
Yeah, community engagement specialist.
Yeah. So I have a question in that context. So for years you've been going out, telling this story as an African-American ranger. I think arguably you've become the most famous ranger in the National Park Service. And so to a large extent, you have already been involved for the last, 20 or more years in that kind of community engagement. So what are you going to do different than what you've already been doing quite naturally?
Well, this time, I think this position affords me the possibility and the space to be strategic in terms of that outreach, because I'm already in California. California is the most populous state. There's so much history that's already here, and everyone that I'm trying to reach, they're already here. I mean, if you're whatever ethnic group you're trying to connect with, they're already here in California. So it's a microcosm of America. So my feeling is, what I'd like to do is to reproduce the Mather Mountain Party. And I know you're familiar with the Mather Mountain Party when Stephen Mather went out into all the different national parks with all these captains of industry in tow so that he could engender their support so that they would become de facto or not so de facto supporters of the fledgling National Park Service.
And let me just interject here briefly that Stephen Mather was the first director of the National Park Service, and he had a real challenge getting people to accept and fund the new National Park Service. So continue, Shelton.
And I've always thought, well, why doesn't the Park Service reproduce that? Why, instead of captains of industry, why can't we just find, but just use African Americans of note in many different spheres of endeavor and have them do the same thing? In other words, why don't we reach the people who reach the people?
Right.
So that's my thought of actually trying to do that here in California with this position. I like to meet people that are in many different fields of endeavor, but they all have something in common. They have influence among African Americans, and if they fall in love with Yosemite, then that love will be transferred to the people who follow them and follow their movements and follow their, what they say on Instagram or what they say on social media. So I think that's about it.
But that's a good segue to me to talk about the fact that you appeared on the Oprah Winfrey Show. And that's kind of why I mentioned that so much of this comes naturally to you and you've already been doing, to some extent. So you appeared on the Oprah Winfrey Show. I think she had a travel segment that she was doing that you appeared on some time ago. And then that led to you writing a letter to inviting, Oprah, who had never camped before or never visited a national park before, to come. So there's no greater influencer on the face of the earth than Oprah Winfrey. So is that where you kind of got the idea? Were you going to go back to Oprah and say, hey, why don't, we start this effort to get influencers? Because she certainly knows people and is connected with people. Is this the kind of thing you're talking about?
Yeah, it was definitely that. I mean, I essentially recognized that it was the number one talk show on the planet, and that the whole issue with the Buffalo Soldier story was that too few of our people, too few African Americans were aware of the significance of the story. They're walking around thinking that they have nothing culturally to tie them to the national park story. And yet here's this history in the Sierra Nevada of 500 Buffalo Soldiers, for 500 African American men, essentially protecting the second and third oldest national parks in the country. So it was essentially a no-brainer. If I want an amplification, Oprah would be perfect to amplify the story by any means necessary. So I just figured, what's so hard about writing a letter? And because my background is writing, it was a good letter. Right. So I wrote her a letter just describing what was happening here. And then I don't know if it was her or the people who worked for her, but someone had the idea that, well, this is really good. This is really interesting. What if we could how about Oprah, you just show up, you come there? So she wanted to surprise me. And so the park knew that she was coming, but I didn't know she was coming.
Oh, I had never heard this part of the story.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, I had no idea that Oprah was coming. All I knew was that what I was told was that some African-American women, courtesy of the Oprah Winfrey Show, were being sent to Yosemite, but they thought they were going to some sort of spa, but they were actually going camping. That's what I was told. So I'm thinking, I have to explain to these African-American women that not only are they not going to a spa, they're actually going to be camping in the Sierra Nevada. I was not looking forward to that conversation. I was dreading it, because I did not think that was going to go over very well. Mm. And so luckily, what I didn't know was that the word of what was really happening was starting to get out, because, Oprah coming to Yosemite, that's kind of hard to keep quiet. So yes. Luckily for management in Yosemite, I had just recently won an award. And if I remember, I think it was at Clemson University. So I had to go to Clemson University in the midst of all of this to accept this award. Well, the management here, they were thrilled, because finally I was away. They were having a hard time keeping it quiet.
That's too funny.
So I was away for about 3 or 4 days, and I came back from Clemson right before she was scheduled to arrive. And I didn't know it was Oprah. I thought it was these women who were going to show up. Mm-hmm. So I'm there with Scott Gettleman, and I know you know Scott. Mm-hmm. And I'm there with Scott, and Scott knew, but he was keeping the secret. So I'm looking for these 6 or 7 women who are supposed to be going camping. And I got to tell them, you're not going camping, or you're not going to the spa. You're going camping. And instead, I just see 2 women walking up, and I'm thinking, who are these 2 women? Where are the other 5? And then I see the woman in front. I'm thinking, God, she looks just like Gayle King. And then I look closer, and I said, that is Gayle King. And then that's when the penny dropped. Yeah. As I realized it was Gayle King, I knew the woman behind her had to be Oprah, and it was. So at that point, I almost had a coronary, which does not look good on live television. And I basically just went into professional mode and welcomed them. I was enthusiastic, but I was not overtly enthusiastic. And unfortunately, apparently that's what her producers, or not her, she was the producer, but that's what her people wanted. They wanted to capture me being completely and absolutely overwhelmed by having Oprah Winfrey, who had read my letter and brought her entire show to Yosemite National Park. What Oprah didn't know was that by the time she showed up in Yosemite, I was just coming off what I refer to as my golden year. I had been on the road with Ken Burns. I was at the Television Critics Association meeting with Ken. I was I was at the White House. I met President Obama with Ken in Dayton. I was at the premiere of the film in New York City, and I was backstage with Eric Benet and Alison Krauss and Peter and Paul of Peter, Paul and Mary, Peter Coyote, Adam Arkin. The list was going on and on. I met the mayor of New York. And so by the time I met Oprah, she was another celebrity. Yes, She was the number one celebrity on the planet. But I was so accustomed to meeting celebrities at that point that I could maintain my demeanor, and I behaved like a ranger should. I just was professional, but they weren't wanting that. They wanted me to be really like, oh my God, I can't believe that you're here. But she was there. I had to believe it.
Well, listen, can you go back, do you think, and round up all of those people, including Oprah and President Obama, and get them to be part of your posse, if you will, to go and take people in an influential way out to parks who've never been there before, a la the Mather posse?
Yeah, I would love to do that because remember, 10 years ago, this summer was Oprah and Gail's visit to Yosemite. It's the 10th anniversary.
Right.
And I would love for her to continue this work because the thing is, as powerful as she is and as powerful an impact that the Oprah Winfrey Show had, it takes more than one massive television event to shift the course of history, to shift the course of where African Americans see themselves as being comfortable and see themselves as being uncomfortable. That is a hard move. That's a hard thing to move. That's a weight of history that takes more than a 2-hour television show, even if it's the 2-hour television show. So I think,
go ahead. I'm sorry.
No. So I think that it would be a perfect opportunity for that to happen. But, Oprah and I, we just don't talk lately. We haven't talked in 10 years.
You're not Twitter buddies or...
Yeah, we're not Twitter buddies.
So, you and I were talking earlier about people feeling comfortable at parks, and I was telling you my story from a kid starting at age 4 visiting national parks, and you were commenting how unusual that is or was for African Americans. I said that had a lot to do with my parents and my mother's attitude towards visiting parks after reading Sunset Magazine and feeling that she needed to visit everywhere Sunset Magazine said people should go. And that my first park at 5 years old was the Grand Canyon. We spent time in the 50s in Yosemite. I never felt uncomfortable anywhere as an African American. Now, I chalked that up to my mother and my parents. So I guess my question is, if you're a young African American in the inner city and your mother and your father say, we're going to go camping in Yosemite or in any national park, and that's what they instill in you from a young person. I guess what I'm saying is the greatest influencers to me can also be, your family and your parents. That's so right. That if you can get parents, a mother and a father, a strong mother, taking their kids out to parks and giving them that experience when they're young, that's extremely lasting as well. So it seems to me you got to make that connection with the parents as well as with these influencers. So one final thing, you've told a lot of stories in the context of the Buffalo Soldiers. Is there something briefly you've never told anyone before in terms of a story or an experience that you've had in life or in national parks that you want to share with our listeners?
I think I've covered just about everything when I've been on stage and when I was, writing Gloryland. But, one thing that I don't think I've really communicated as much as some of these other thoughts is just what he might have been looking for, what he might have wanted, at the end of things. And my thought was that he probably would have just liked to have a cabin somewhere in the mountains by a stream or a creek where he could just sit there and just see the sun come up in the morning and see the sun go down in the evening and feel the wind on his face and feel how wind is without any type of means of holding it in place. It's just something that it's the ultimate freedom, is to be air, to be atmosphere, and to have that on his face and to have the light of the sun on him and have that wind. I think it would feel that it was liberating. I mean, that's the one of the few things that I think of when I think of liberation. I think of the wind, that it moves where it wants to move, when it wants to move. It's sometimes warm, it's sometimes cold, but it's always alive. It's the breath of something higher than us and more powerful than us and kinder than us. And so I've always had that feeling like what was Elijah's secret kind of dream or hope, And I think that that would be the ultimate liberation, to be near a mountain somewhere or in the mountains somewhere and have no request for him to do this or do that, but just to be able to just sit there, listen to a river or a stream and feel the sun in his face and know that he is truly free.
There's something very Siddhartha-esque about that. When I was reading your book and listening to you, it harkened back to the book Siddhartha that we all had to read when we were in college. And that was the feeling. I don't know if you felt that way too, but that was certainly one of the feelings I came away with, especially as in the opening of the book when he's sitting by the stream. And
well, that's the thing about Siddhartha. Is that it's underrated in our culture, the power of stillness, of not just being quiet, but being open to everything that's around you. And it's like, we have even phrase like, don't just sit there like a rock. I'm thinking we should all sit like a rock.
Yes.
Because rocks don't create the hardships and the adversity and the horrors that people sometimes do. Rocks are just there. Their only ambition is to be what they are.
Exactly. Well, my first experience with that, and maybe we'll wrap up with this thought, was with Native Americans who I met with often on a variety of issues. But the big issues was when the Native American Grave and Repatriation Act was first passed some years ago, and Native Americans finally got an opportunity to repatriate their remains. And we had many, many meetings about this. But one of the things that, especially several of the California Native American tribes did, was they said, we have to sit and we have to be quiet. And that has to be a part of the meeting. And they absolutely insisted upon that. And I remember to this day, the first meeting, how uncomfortable everyone was with having to be quiet. And if we would reach a point of conflict or a seeming point of impasse, one of the elders would say, we just have to be quiet.
Yeah.
And then for sometimes we would just sit there for 10 or 15 minutes and nobody would talk. And it made all the difference in the world. I'll never forget it.
That doesn't surprise me, because we're in a culture where look at there's talk shows, right? But there aren't silence shows. Shows that focus on, I didn't hear anything for 30 minutes. It was completely quiet. Is that a problem? Well, I don't know. I got really relaxed after a bit, and actually it was kind of soothing.
Exactly.
You know what I mean? We're always trying to fill that silence with our thoughts and but not be filled by that silence.
Yeah.
And
Absolutely.
if we could allow ourselves to be filled by the silence instead of trying to fill the silence, well, that would lead to less conversations with psychologists.
Indeed. Well, Shelton, thank you so much for joining the podcast. Life is a story we tell ourselves, and we've had some great stories from you today, as well as some great insights. And I really wish you the best in your community outreach, something that I think you've already been doing for the last 30 years, by the way. But now, like you say, perhaps you can take it to another level. Thank you, Shelton. I hope to talk to you again soon. Let's not let so much time go past before we get together again.
Well, we can have another conversation. I'm happy about that.
Okay, sounds great. And you're always welcome to come high in the Andes. We live at about 9,000 feet between two extinct volcanoes. It's one of the most beautiful places in the world, and I'd love to host you one day.
Well, I hope that comes to pass, because that sounds absolutely wonderful.
All right. Take care, my friend.
All right. Thanks a lot, Don. I appreciate it.
A very warm thank you to Shelton for joining us on this week's episode of the podcast. Life is a story we tell ourselves. You can find us on the web at lifeisastorypodcast.com. There you will also find links to Shelton Johnson's book and audiobook. I grew up in the park system, and my appreciation for nature is still deeply ingrained in both my body and my spirit. Thanks to people like my parents and park ranger Shelton Johnson, the world of our country's park system has never been beyond my reach. Next week, join us for an interview with award-winning environmental journalist and science writer Paul Rogers. To stay up to date on more upcoming exciting interviews, subscribe to the podcast. Don't forget to like the podcast and share with your family and friends. From our family to yours, stay safe, share happiness, and remember, the important thing is not to stop questioning. Curiosity has its own reason for existing. And now we'll end this episode with more flute music from Park Ranger Shelton Johnson. Thank you for joining us.